century, literati began to discuss Zhong as both historical place and as culture. These writers were opposed to an expansionist foreign policy that tried to incorporate outsiders into the empire. This paper takes up the cultural interpretation of mobility from a spatial perspective. Just like we can view social mobility as crossing Li. Mobility requires the existence of boundaries and limits, for without them mobility would be a meaningless term. The most concrete manifestation of the idea of boundaries are spatial borders, whether between prefectures or countries. In contrast to social boundaries, which we easily see as being culturally constructed, political borders appear to be closer to physical objects in that they can be described and delineated. This inquiry is focused on the middle period from the start of Tang's decline in the mid-8th century to the consolidation of Ming rule in the early 15th period. It considers the views of both Chinese literati and foreign conquerors. It asks how this was done, what meaning was attached to being inside them or outside them, and what different approaches were meant to accomplish. The term Zhong was a vehicle for both a spatial claim that there was spatial area that had a continuous history going back to the central states of the Eastern Zhou. It was also a cultural claim that there was a continuous culture that had emerged in that place which its inhabitant ought to, but might not, continue. The use of the Zhong was also a spatial definition. It asserted that this guo was central relative to all others. This asymmetry helps explain why outsiders were at best ambivalent about adopting the term Zhong in a cultural sense. By doing so they were locating themselves as ed. In translating the Zhong as the central country, I have rejected its common translation as the Middle Kingdom. Middle period writers were interested in the possibility of a transdynastic spatio-cultural entity. Today China is a nation-state that claims a history that includes many different dynastic states. The concept of national history in its current Western usage was wholly unfamiliar to Chinese historians before the 20th century. The spatio-temporal term we use, China, originates in the Sanskrit China but enters into Latinate languages rather late, from the Persian toponym Chin. Europe of the Middle Ages used the term Cathay, which came through Inner Asia. The ancient term Zhong was adopted and entered into the new nationalist education program. But this modern term, which I shall transcribe as Zhonghua, was deployed in new ways, as the equivalent of the Western term China. In other words, the use of China and Chinese began as a Western usage. They were then adopted by the government of the people the West called the Chinese to identify their own country. China recognizes that its population is composed of different peoples. This took place in the context of establishing the equality of this country in international relations and creating a Western-style nation-state. At least officially there is no such thing as the Chinese language, although in informal practice the term Chinese pertains to Han ethnicity. The use of the term Zhonghua during the Middle Period came to encapsulate a particular kind of national historical consciousness. It was not the same as the modern term China, yet was different from what had gone before. A striking feature of Middle Period intellectual culture was its interest in envisioning Eastern Zhou. Continuity through space and time, even if it lacked the equivalent of a transdynastic country name such as China. We find this in well-known historical works. To use comprehensive canons from the late 8th century. Sima Guang's, 1019–1086, Comprehensive Mirror for Aid in Government. The map of the traces of U is grid map scaled at 100 li, ca 30 miles, to the square, about a 1 minute and 4.5 seconds million scale. It aims at accuracy in depicting the coastline, rivers, lakes and mountains, with the depicted river system being an attempt to capture the uncertain account of the rivers in the ancient text. The map is far more accurate than other known contemporary maps. It belongs to a tradition of spatially accurate national map-making, dating back to the Pei Xiu, 224–271. The point of the map is not spatial accuracy but a historical claim. The present world is continuous with antiquity. The extensive record of the realm is a privately compiled historical gazetteer in 2 parts. It includes 44 maps and accompanying texts, from antiquity through the Northern Song. The maps are based on a common template that includes the Great Wall and northern Song prefectures. They cover mainly what we would today call China proper. Northern Song prefectures. The second part details the Song administrative hierarchy, down to the county level, and gives the administrative history of each. The preface suggests that this is not only a reference work, readers should see from it that there is spatial continuity between the present and antiquity. This conclusion apparently is meant to support the compiler's stated opposition to the court's efforts to expand Song territory. The handy atlas makes clear that the subject is the land of the Hua in its first two maps but almost never uses the term Zhonggua. Taken together, these works show how much middle period views had departed from what Mark Lewis sees in early China. Universality was asserted as a privilege of the ruler and his agents, while ordinary people remained locked in the limited realms defined by their households. There was a long tradition of treating a succession of dynastic states as the line of continuity connecting the present to antiquity. Each dynastic state had its own name, administrative system, and territorial claims. The Great Song state succeeded the last of the 5 short-lived dynasties of the north that followed the demise of the Great Tang state. The last great debate over this sort of legitimate succession took place in the Great Jin state, 1115 to 1234, of the Jurchens. It has been argued that the decision during the Yuan to compile dynastic histories of Liao, Song, and Jin changed the situation by treating conquest dynasties as equally legitimate. Dynastic states defined space and time and social position, making it possible to locate any person or locality with reference to the state. The works discussed above were transdynastic. They supplied ways of thinking about the larger entity that states, localities, and individuals were part of. But why not make Zhonggua the term for this entity? Central Country posited an entity that existed in a particular kind of relationship to a larger world. Belonging to the central county was a matter of cultural participation rather than administrative subordination. Dynastic states did not define the central country, but they could claim to be it. The term Zhonggua appears in discussions of relations with the larger world. Yijin was being challenged on two fronts, by the growing economic, cultural, and political importance of the south and the state building of the northern peoplist. Those outside, both pastoral tribal formations and sedentary bureaucratic states, were typically referred to collectively as Yi. As middle period writers deployed it, the term Zhonggua was both an historically defined place the central states of the feudal lords loyal to the Easter Zhou in the Central Plain. Space and culture were analytically separate but mutually dependent. If the central country was only defined by culture, then wherever the culture existed defined the space where it belonged. The southern statecraft writer Chen Liang used both spatial and cultural perspectives in making arguments for the recovery of the northern Central Plain. Chen grants that the historical culture of the Zhonggua could continue outside its original historical space, but he contends that without recovering that space, Song would ultimately lose authority. 100 generations of emperors and kings have continued in succession. How could this be violated by the perverse chi of the Ed from outside of heaven and earth? Unfortunately, they were able to violate it, with the result that the robes and caps, rites and music of the Zhonggua have been taken. The Song dynasty in the south has the culture but not the space. If those who occupy the Central Plain adopt the culture of the Zhonggua as well, then they will be legitimate and Song will lose its claim to be the rightful ruler of all under heaven. The sages defended the Zhonggua with canons and limited the Ed with borders, thus to make clear that they were not to mix. However, the mandate resides with the populace, and, in that regard, it was not appropriate to make a distinction between Ed and Zhonggua. The constant way of handling the Ed was most developed in Zhou, and its transformation is recorded in the Spring and Autumn Annals. The Zhou solution was separation, but as Zhou declined, the Zhonggua and Ed were mixed together and became one. After that, the southern state of Chu first usurped the title of king and, using the ways of the Ed, acted up in Zhonggua. In asserting that the possession of the Central Plain was of the essence, thus leaving the south spatially marginal. Chen Liang was taking a narrower spatial view than necessary. Humankind is central to heaven and earth because the extension of all that is good depends on there being properly cultivated humans to effect it. In southern Song Hongmai noted that in Zhou times, in contrast to his own, the territory of the Zhongguo was extremely narrow. The territory included only several tens of modern prefectures. It apparently was barely 1/5 of all under heaven, which suggests that for Hong the central country was not fixed in space. During 3 reigns used the term Zhongguo in relation to outside states 166 times. In contrast, Great Song, state, appears half as often and then in formal exchanges between states. Still, the use of Zhongguo carries a certain spatial ambiguity. Does the common phrase the ED refer to the central plain or to the state that claims to be the central country? We might ask the same on reading this call to recover the 16 lost prefectures. The 16 Tang prefectures Song claimed but never held, know that their state will perish and that the Zhongguo will necessarily want its former territory. Thus they will not fight but will accept our guidance. But if the intention of the Zhongs is to necessarily destroy them, then the caitiffs will later persuade the Jurchens to violate the central plain and threaten our base, all in order to have vengeance. This would be the worst mistake the Zhongguo could make. It is generally held that Confucius already had the idea that the centrality of the Zhongguo was justified by its role as the source of civilizing models. The phrase that sums this up in commentaries from the Middle Period on comes from Han Ye's influential essay, On the Origin of the Way. Han Ye's Way of the Sages was derived from an understanding of antiquity. The men of Zhongguo have maintained it through the generations. For Han Yu, the transmission of this way had taken place in a certain place, but it had also been lost in that same place. His mission was to persuade literati to rediscover it for themselves. If there is any distance from the way in one's personal behavior, then this mind will have died. The ED were able to maintain trust and righteousness, but the fact of our breaking the treaty and losing trust thus caused such anger among the ED. Every time one reads his letter, it pains the reader. From a Neo-Confucian philosophical perspective, there was no justification. Zhu Zai's answer is that the sages had, by transforming the inhabitants of the central state with culture, differentiated them, although some customs from those primitive undifferentiated times had survived. He explains, in the most ancient times the Zhou were one family and the Zhongguo one person. Lu Jiuyuan had a similar explanation. The Zhongguo obtained the qi of centrality and harmony, and this necessarily was where ritual and righteousness resided. It followed that the central country was the only available vehicle for defending that culture against the ED. In short, it was the culture facilitated by superior geography, not inherent human differences. Huaxia occupies the center of the land, and living things receive qi that is correct. Since the 3 kings and 5 emperors, every generation has had men appropriate to it. Filial piety and parental caring were born here, kindness and love became strong here. Praise the purity of the past in order to encourage them to admire it. It is common for humans to feel that the antiquity was better than the present. But it was perhaps not free of degenerate customs and corrupt habits. Think back to the Zhonghua of antiquity, they were in many ways. Attempts to conquer the ED have failed repeatedly, at tremendous human cost. They do not bring into being sages and worthies, no one reforms their old customs, or instructs them as to what is not permitted. They are outside and not inside, they are distant and not close. If they come, then control them, if they depart, then defend against them. Thus, geographic naturalistic explanation for cultural progress was based on the central plain. He roots cultural superiority in geographic space. But some were more willing than Chen Liang to imagine that in cultural terms the central country could exist independently of its spatial origins. Yi Shi quoted approvingly from the strategies of the warring states, the Zhongguo is the place where perspicacity and intelligence abide. In almost the cases discussed above, the speakers use the term Zhong when they want to make a distinction between their country and the other. This is not simply to reinforce a sense of superiority, they are making a point about the nature of the difference. The central country has its position by virtue of its culture. Shi explains this in a series of essays on foreign relations. For the Zhongguo, not to govern the is principle. We are in control of both. If we cast aside the tools by which we will necessarily be victorious and merely rely on deceit and force, then we will have transformed ourselves into Lu Zuqian, friend of Shi and Chen Liang, taught one of the important texts from the New Policies era, Fan Zu's Mirror of the Tang. To argue for living up to one's own values and against imperial expansion had particular salience. Shun said, reject schemers and the man and will lead each other in submitting. When the central country fails in governance, then the four attack. We can know in general how the former kings controlled them. They ordered the inside and gave security to the outside. Although they are they are also like the people of the central country. They pursue the beneficial and avoid the harmful, they desire life and dislike death. A king nurtures everything within heaven and earth. He ought even to care about the birds and beasts, the shrubs and trees. Would he want to destroy them? When one of our rulers takes their territory, he cannot occupy it. When he gets their people, he cannot command them. Better not to take them and not to lose. Improve our ritual and music and administration. Nurture our people with beneficence, so that farmers have surplus grain and women have surplus cloth. Peace is brought about without warfare. Fan Zuyu, Taizong boasted of his achievement and ability, his ambitions were infinite. He wanted to make Hua and Yi, central and foreign, one. This was not the way to create a legacy and bring security to the central country. This ought to be a warning and is not to be admired. The Jurchens, after their conquest of the northern part of Song, were undecided about whether they would be an external state that had taken possession of the central plain or whether they were going to recast themselves as the latest incarnation of the central country. In the end, Yi, Fan, Lu, Du, and Zhu can only say that the central country is responsible for maintaining its own standards of morality without pressing them on others and for defending itself. Zhong supported a retrenchment. Yet his administration tried both to maintain its otherness. Texts in Chinese that quote Jurchen leaders occasionally use the term the Zhongguo. It is not immediately clear when a speaker is making a reference to the space of the ancient central states. Jurchen court's leaders differ from the Manchus in the late 17th and 18th centuries in two respects. First, the Jurchens do not assert, as Qing emperors, but not literati, did, that the Zhongguo was coterminous with their territory. Second, the various frontier peoples that earlier times had called no. The Jurchens do not make a point of recognizing the Zhongguo as transdynastic cultural entity representing civilized life. What the Jurchens did contribute was a rather different and, from the documentary evidence, a far more common approach. This was the legal recognition of ethnopolitical distinctions among the various peoples they had conquered. Use of Hanren to refer to the native inhabitants of the conquered territory began with the medieval northern conquest dynasties. It was an ethnocultural distinction as in their clothing and speech. I see not evidence that it was used in this period as an ideological foundation for state building. In Liao, Jin, and Yuan sources there are frequent references to ethnocultural groups. The Yuan relied heavily on quotas in apportioning office and giving access to resources. Court policy sometimes distinguished between different groups, as we have seen above. But sometimes it lumped groups into larger categories. In Whichch the order of precedence corresponded to the sequence of conquest or submission, the Meng, Gu, the various tribes of Mongolia, Esimu, literally the many kinds, referring to the various Central Asian peoples, Hanren, the Khitan, Jurchen, and Hanren population of Jin, and Nanren. Nuzhen who have lived a long time in Han areas are, to be treated, the same as Han, Ren. From an imperial perspective, one advantage of speaking in terms of ethnopolitical groups was that it avoided suggesting that the central country and certain population groups had a privileged cultural authority. At one point, presumably to prevent boundary crossing into higher offices that required literacy, it was ordered that Hanren and Nanren are forbidden to learn Menggu and Mu 71 writing. The fact that Imperial Yuan had integrated all under heaven, including both the Zhong and the foreign, was rarely celebrated. Instead, we find opposition to expeditions against the Southwei. Ntry, you ought to practice the affairs of the central country. The heir apparent could be ordered to learn the writing of Hanren without allowing an implication of centrality. The Great Ming state went on to fight wars against the Mongols, Vietnamese, and the Japanese in Korea. After trying to close foreign trade for a century, it traded with East and Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, Africa, Europe, and the New World. The Ming founder attempted to sort out the conundrum created by the fact that despite the ancient distinction between the Zhong and the Ed, for the past century the Yi had also been emperors. After Song, he explained, heaven's mandate to rule had gone to an extraordinary man from the desert. In letters to the rulers of foreign states, he challenges the legitimacy of the Yuan on cultural grounds. In the past, our Zhong was unjustly occupied by the nomads for 100 years, and they then had the Ed spread across the four quarters, abolishing our Zhong's moral norms. I am sending ambassadors to report to all countries. Once the Song gift was transferred, the Yuan as Northern Yi entered and ruled the Zhong, all inside and outside the four seas submitted as subjects. Ming founder does not appeal to place or the right of the Hanren and Nanren as inhabitants to rule. Rather, he puts culture over place. The way people lived, their sense of morality, the cultural forms they employed ought to dominate the Zhong. Zhu claims to be committed to it, and it is this that justifies driving out the Northern Yi and establishing his own political power. Ming founder was joining those literati from north and south who had distinguished a culture with a history. The founder, although not free of imperial designs, defined the limits on Ming expansion, and thus accepted what his use of the Zhong implied. His successors were less restrained in their exercise of imperial power abroad. In 1449 the emperor was captured on an expedition against the Mongols north of the Great Wall. The issue of the central country's relations with the countries of the Ed came once again to the fore. The Mongols were illegitimate rulers because they did not honor the cultural tradition of ancient Zhou, and led our people of the Zhong to forsake it themselves. There is no great virtue in trying to attract the Ed to submit, virtue is culturally specific. This does not mean that foreign relations should be cut off. Instead, they should be intensively managed and supervised. The modern use of Zhongguo/China is different from the middle period use of the Zhongguo/the central country. Perhaps for the first time we have the idea that the central country belongs to a certain group of people as much as it does to a culture. Qiu Juns opposed an expansionist foreign policy because they denied that historically different cultures could be harmoniously absorbed into a single polity. Such a position did lead to an acceptance of foreign states, but not to engaging them as partners in any kind of international mission. In this view, the relationship with foreign states was fundamentally defensive. It seems to me that these two possibilities do not entirely fit a Chinese/foreign dichotomy. It is true that the proponents of central country culture were literati who saw themselves as being the bearers of that culture. But they found allies among highly placed Khitans, Jurchens, Central Asians, and Mongols. The introduction of ethnopolitical distinctions as a crucial factor in public life had influence that in Ming could link a people with a polity. It was the very opposite of what foreign conquerors had tried to achieve. In Ming they found supporters among the inhabitants of northern and southern China who were, after all, guaranteed a share.